So let's take a trip down memory lane. Obsidian Entertainment. The name alone conjures up images of greatness. Fallout New Vegas, a game that still got fans praying it at its altar years later. They gave us Pillars of Eternity, a modern classic that reminded us why we fell in love with RPGs in the first place. Even South Park, The Stick of Truth, the game with farts and laughs, a wild card that really nailed humor and gameplay. They pulled it off too. So this is a studio that's been a titan in the gaming world. It often outshining the big dogs, like Bethesda at their own game. So when Avowed, it was announced, when it hit the scenes, expectations were high. People naturally expecting something with a studio, from a studio with this pedigree and this kind of funding backed by Microsoft. Expecting something great, expecting that wow factor, that enthusiastic experience. And I think when it comes to that, the game underperformed. The game was fine, the game was meh, the game was mid, as the young people would say, but it wasn't great. And so that's what we're gonna explore in this video, from the technical standpoint, from the cultural standpoint. So make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell for more videos like this. And let's just dive straight into it. So again, the reception was kind of meh. It's actually mostly positive on Steam. It's 77% positive. So that's not awful, but again, for Obsidian, that's like kind of like, you get a B plus on a test you aced in your sleep back in the day, that kind of vibe. Metacritic is at 81, so it's not the glowing praise you'd expect for this kind of game. And big reviewers like IGN, they're hyping it up. They're calling it deeply immersive RPG. I wouldn't really use those words. I think really the redeeming factor is probably combat and parkour, and even that is like kind of old-fashioned. In fact, that's exactly what Eurogamer, for example, stated in their review. They call the game old-fashioned. And then Luke Stevens, who's usually kind of a fence-sitter, his review was like a plot twist, honestly, that nobody saw coming, because he was very sore about it. In his review, he kind of slammed it for bugs, quests breaking, save files corruption, crashes galore, and he called it borderline unplayable. So that was at launch. That was with review code. So for a guy who's usually measured, that kind of heat was a shock, honestly. And so the real question is, is that a flawed diamond or is it a fall from grace? How would you characterize this game? And if you look at the sales numbers, it gets even more fuzzy, because reportedly the game has reached about 6 million players in the first month. And so that's more than Indiana Jones The Great Circle, so like another Microsoft exclusive. So this seems like they're doing better, but if you dig into it, you realize again, 5.9, almost 6 million players, that's got an asterisk. And that's that most of those players are Game Pass. And so when you look at the raw sales numbers, we don't know exactly, but concurrent players on Steam were about 17,000, which is way below like Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example, which released at the same time. So Microsoft's out here claiming they're happy, but for a publisher of their size and Obsidian's legacy, happy in this case, could be translated as miserable. I would say. So here's the thing. How does a studio like Obsidian, like with a history of dropping like bangers, like people love, like iconic games, how do they land on this? How do they end up with a fine game, a mid game, I think there's a lot to it. So let's jump into it and let's just do this autopsy of the corpse of Avowed. So first thing we should go through is the development, because I think a lot of the things went wrong during the development. It's a long development cycle, even for a modern game. It's 7 years in development. It started in 2018. Obsidian was still independent studio, and they were pitching this idea really of they were looking for investors, looking for a buyer really, and they pitched the idea of a fantasy, fantasy of the Elder Scrolls, and it's kind of like wrapped in the lore of their Pillars of Eternity, but it's a multiplayer game. It's like a co-op RPG, so it kind of meant to capitalize on this live service craze that was really sweeping the industry. Like, it's back in 2018, so you got Fortnite, you got Battle Royales, you got this whole Game Pass. Not Game Pass, but Game Pass was still not a thing then, but the monetization was really evolving, and they were kind of pitching in that direction. So it was more of a multiplayer experience. So Microsoft, they're on a buying spree, they're buying everything, so they end up acquiring Obsidian. And so Project Alabama, as Avowed was called then, gets greenlit, and they start developing. About 100 developers. And 8 months in, they make a pivot. They say, okay, well, we're actually better at single player experiences, narrative driven, Fallout New Vegas type of thing, right? So let's just do that. Let's stay away. So commendable, you would say, right? Like there were like other studios that were specialized in single player games that made multiplayer games that failed. So that seemed like the right decision back then. But it's like building a 2-story building on the foundations of a skyscraper. You kind of, and even today when you play the game, a month past launch, you see the immovable NPCs that don't have any kind of routine or life. They're just sitting there, stationary. It makes sense if your cities are hubs for a multiplayer game. It doesn't make sense if they are in a single player game. So a lot of elements of the game reflect that lack of identity, lack of singular vision from the beginning to the end. So in any case, so they're still early in development, but they released the first trailer in 2020, and Kerry Patel steps in as a game director in January 21. So she's been directing Outer Worlds expansion or DLC, I think, and she now, in her own words, she says it was like building the tracks while the train is running. It was a very frantic, iterative process, cutting features, reshaping the story, finding a tone. Somewhat, I think, initially it started with a grim kind of dark fantasy. It kind of moved to the colorful and weird. And there were several reboots during this creative process. And they pivoted more in that semi-linear structure of the Outer Worlds rather than Skyrim's like endless plains, open world kind of thing. They doubled down on that. And then the next few years, it was just finishing that. If you look at the job listings from late 2019, there were early ambitions like combat with first-person melee experience, branching dialogue, Unreal Engine expertise. But by 2022, you see a lot of talent sipping off, a lot of lost leads. It's a struggling project. The talent, I mean, it's just not the same studio that built those previous games, right? So even the name is there, it's kind of not the same people. So a lot of the talent sips off. So in 23, the game resurfaces, new gameplay trailer, promising. People are relatively hyped. It gets one delay, and it launches in 25 February. I mean, it reads like a cautionary tale of ambition clashing with identity. It started as a multiplayer game, morphed into single player, lost its way through reboots, landed as a game that, despite its long gestation, felt oddly rushed and focused. And these constant shifts left scars. None of that, I think, would have been as bad as what comes next, which is the political, cultural controversy, which some of you are familiar with, but if you aren't, Avowed, it's not just technical hiccups or gameplay gripes. Like, Avowed walked straight into a political buzzsaw, and a lot of that heat came from one person. So Matt Hansen, the game's director, who in late 2024, when the game was supposed to launch and then it was postponed, supposedly because of the competition. I think these claims, these posts by Matt Hansen played a role as well into postponing the game, because it was a really big controversy. So in late 24, he goes to X and he starts posting his opinions, and he started getting vocal about his approach to art direction, and emphasizing diversity and inclusion, and how he doesn't want white people developing games, and it gets more and more radical, and how the things like character pronouns and a cast that leans hard into quote unquote representation he's gonna like double down on it now that Trump selected, or Elon Musk is tweeting how he doesn't like wokeness in games. So Hansen at the time, he starts basically bragging about prioritizing these things, and not just that, but bragging about prioritizing portfolios, like portfolio reviews for black artists over others, like the actual people creating the game as well. So full on DEI programming, right? And so he's framing it as this revolutionary fight against the norms and the patriarchy or whatever. But so that alone raises eyebrows. But then you have the real fireworks come with Elon Musk. He clashes with Elon Musk, and Musk says, he's confessing to illegal behavior. It won't end well for him. So he gets into this direct conflict with Elon Musk, which is kind of totally strange, that we live in the world where a video game is in the center of this cultural, political war. I mean, Elon Musk is a advisor to Donald Trump now, to the US president. He's one of the most powerful people in the cabinet, and he's over there on X arguing with Matt Hansen. It's kind of weird, but that's where we are. That's the timeline. And so basically the way it gets heats up, you have people like Chris Avellone, ex Obsidian dev, who comes in and calls it the legal definition of discrimination. So people storm up on Matt Hansen. He deletes the tweets, or he privates the account, and is no longer doing public announcements anymore. But the whole thing, echoes a kind of attitude that these developers have towards their target audience, where they don't really like the target audience. They don't really try to pander to it. They're trying to change their own audience, not just the culture, but the people themselves. So, but then by early 25, Avowed's punching bag in the ongoing gaming culture wars. Steam forums and X threads buzz with players vowing to skip it. Some tying Hansen's comments to broader gripes about Microsoft influence and woke ideology, sipping into Game Pass titles, the quotas, the mandatory DEI stuff. And I mean, despite that, like Fandom Wire reports that Avowed still outsold Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, for example, which was also under criticism. But that it's an evidence that this controversy didn't tank sales. Maybe they even helped sales, but it definitely didn't help the vibes. So what is the real damage? His statement didn't just stir the pot; it dumped it over the stove, you could say. It gave ammo to critics who already saw Avowed as a symbol of corporate meddling and ideological overreach, especially under Microsoft's umbrella. So the focus on most characters are black women or weird cultural or character features, exaggerated customization options, the divinity marks, however they call it in the lore. It's bizarre. It's kind of like this weird, grotesque art that is present, not just in games, but in other forms of art, in architecture in our cities, this formless slop you could see everywhere. So obviously none of that helped the case. It's the perception of this game as such that made it more about politics than play. And whether that's fair or not, it stuck. It drags Obsidian's reputation through the mud, and it really leaves the fans wondering if the studios lost the old magic and if it's still the same, which I think conclusively it's not the same. And I would like to end this autopsy with a review of the technical problems and the innovation. So, if Avowed was supposed to be Obsidian's next-gen game, the RPG crown, the magnum opus, 7 years development, unlimited funds, let's say, or as much as they could get, how did it land on the technical side? How did it land on the experience side of the game? Well, it was a whiff. It was a whiff rather than a bang. So let's just say a lot of players felt like they'd seen this movie before. From launch day, glitches that turned quests into error codes, design that was quite uninventive. People compared the game to Skyrim and even older Bethesda titles, and a lot of the features that were present there are not here. So what happened? These games came out like 20 years ago. So how did the studio with such a pedigree end up, tripping on its own sword, if you could say it? Let's break it down. So I think let's just talk about the tech troubles. So players can't get past loading screens. Steam forums report crashes, hard crashes, the kind that reboot your Xbox or blue screen your PC. Quests are a mess. Players flag bugs like the rat problem quest stalling out, the NPCs vanishing mid-dialogue, or the light in the dark mission breaking if you dare save at the wrong moment. Windows Central bug roundup notes disappearing companions, broken climbing mechanics, and even save file corruption. That means hours of progress wiping out like a bad dream. This is what Luke Stevens talked about in his YouTube takedown of the game. He calls it unplayable at launch. Now Obsidian patched some of this fast. Update 1.0.2 drops within a week, but the damage is done. The reputation is tarnished, and it's kind of like the case with Cyberpunk 2077. It's way better, of course, than that case, but it's about the reputation that the game gets. And again, it's not like you didn't have time to polish. And so Kerry Patel, though, she anticipated this. She gave an interview before the game was launched, and she said, quote, "You gotta accept a little jank to do something fun and creative." And that's fair, maybe. for a scrappy indie title. But for a Microsoft-backed AAA game, it doesn't sit right with me, at least. And even if we should accept it for doing something fun and creative, what is so fun and creative about this game? What is innovation here? What's new? You know, the comparisons with Bethesda titles, the openish zone, the faction quest, the big plague threatening the world, all these motifs, they're all movies we've already seen in those games, right? Games rather noted it might look like Skyrim, but argued it leaned closer to the Outer Worlds in tone. The problem is players didn't buy the distinction. On X, RPG Fanatic called it Skyrim with a pillar skin, while Legacy Killa griped it's 2025 and we're still swinging swords like it's 2011. And the combat with dual-wielding wands and blades was flashy, but the reviews like Eurogamers point out it got repetitive fast, lacking the depth of, say, Baldur's Gate 3's tactical crunch, and I 100% would agree with that. You know, Obsidian pitched Avowed as a fresh take, blending kind of different influences, you know, Pillars lore, accessible action, you know, there were no classes, so they ditched the enemy scaling for hand-tuned fights system, so it's kind of that old school challenged. And in terms of narrative, you got companion stories, but I mean, again, none of that is new. I mean, that's Mass Effect 2. That's, I mean, in terms of companion stories, like the, and again, you don't have to be always new and inventive, but I mean, if that's the case, then at least get the bottom line, like at least get the basics right, you know. And I do think the combat is redeeming quality of the game, but I do think it's worth it on Game Pass to give it a shot. But again, that is the problem, that if we're making games for Game Pass, then they're always going to be this mid. We're never going to aim at greatness. At least that's the business model here. And there's some other things, you know, people had gripes with, like the zoned world, which is kind of like the compromise between the Elder Scrolls openness and the and their previous titles limited world design. You know, Screen Rant warned that Avowed success might kill Bethesda by outdoing them at their own game. That was in anticipation. They had that article, but I think most players saw it the other way around. It's like Bethesda's DNA was all over the game, but without the scale, without the features, without the freedom, without the, you know, the experimental quality to the game. Like the freedom of choices that like New Vegas had, for example. So for example, some reviews on Steam lamented it's not bad, but it's not bold. Obsidian played safe when they could have swung big. So that's how I would put it as well. And yeah, maybe it is the lack of talent, maybe it is the fact that it's not the same ship, it's not the same crew. Maybe it was the ambition that faltered. Despite the long dev cycle, a lot of problems in the vision, a mismanagement, just like with so many modern titles. It didn't push boundaries, it borrowed them, it polished them, and called it a day. And for a studio that once redefined RPGs, that felt like a step back, I would say. So it's again what I say, like for any product, especially for cultural products where there's so much competition, you need to be ambitious in what you're creating. You need to create that wow factor, that enthusiastic experience. When you buy a game, when you take that product, when you experience the product, you should be like I'm really happy I own this. I'm really happy with the quality of this. And that's just not how Avowed hits. And then, you know, people will wait for the discount or just get it on Game Pass, which I guess that's the reality we live in. The beige mediocrity of subscription-based model. Nobody ever has to make a great game because everybody will play your game anyway, because at least for a couple of hours, because it's in Game Pass. So that would be the anatomy of a failure, guys. I think, just to sum it up, how we come here, you have this really, in many people's opinion, one of the favorite RPG developers of all time. I mean, Fallout New Vegas, that game is so big, and then they say they're happy with 77 positive on Steam, with 81 on Metacritic, with 6 million players, most of it on Game Pass for how much is it? $1, $2, $5 a month. 7 years in development. Chaotic pivot from multiplayer to single player, plagued by reboots. And unhinged art director Matt Hansen's, I don't know how would I characterize his comments about diversity, his comments about how he sees creativity. The fact that people like this are in creative roles in this industry and other entertainment in the West, in the USA primarily, is really bad. It's really bad fact. It's a fact that kind of, I think more than anything, witnesses to the fact of the state of education in the West. The state of universities, which are all cultural Marxist, which are all liberal, which are all anti-Western civilization. It's a system that from inside is killing itself. It's like cancer. It's really bad. And we need more right-wing people creating art. And so part of this channel's mission is to inspire and support that kind of thinking. So if you have any suggestions about some based games or based movies or anything really, I mean, I'm willing to expand the topics we talk about on this channel. It's mostly going to be about culture, of course, but just to kind of promote some healthy culture. We're not Puritan, we're not crazy, we want our civilization to perpetuate, and culture is a means by which ideas perpetuate. And that's how I would, just to finish my finishing thoughts on Avowed. No singular vision, bogged down by a decrepit and greedy monetization scheme, Microsoft Game Pass, and muddled aesthetics that fueled controversy over pronouns and diversity, proving once again even legends can falter when creativity gets lost in corporate slop. Full stop, guys. Make sure you follow and share, and until next time, cheers.